Good day, Mr. Palmer, sir. How are you?
Doing good, Mr. Deegan. How you doing?
Outstanding. Any day I get to talk to you is a good day, and lucky for me, we talk every day. So it's a good day.
Yeah. See, now that we have video, I can't hide my looks anymore of knowing full well that, you know, days that you talk to me are not always good days because I don't always bring great things to you. I just
So what are you saying? We make you shower? Is that what you're saying? Like we make you dress up?
no. What I'm saying is well, there's that, but we won't go into that conversation. No, what I'm saying is
Off the
we
rails
talk
in
every
under a
day,
minute.
and I don't always bring you good things. So every day you get to talk to me is not always a good day because I generally bring problems just as much as I bring solutions. So
Yeah, everybody brings problems, but it's you bring your smiling happy face, even if the smiling happy face is telling me a whole load of not good stuff. But anyways, the upside is we can shatter the reality of when we're recording this. We are recording this on a Friday afternoon, which has to be a good thing because the weekend is in sight. It is. It's right around the corner, even though this is terrifying.
Everybody who's listening to this, welcome to the beginning of the week because it's Tuesday.
It is Tuesday when you'll hear it. So
you're just getting started. So
that's why it sounds, we're all so cheerful. And people are going to turn it on Tuesday morning. They're like, wow, they're really happy, but they recorded it on Friday afternoon. So, but no, the reality is this is not going to be a quiet weekend for us. Total tangent. We've got a lot of prep to do for, WLPC, which we'll talk about in a future episode potentially. So it's not going to be a quiet weekend.
Speaking of, I was just looking at the chat for WLPC.
Oh yeah.
And they're confirming that they are at full capacity / sold out at 375. So
I think we're over that, John, to be honest.
You have work to do. I have work to do. We have lots of work to do. So
yeah, I think we're over that though, because you and I both know that there's some overflow happening. So we'll see. It's going to be a busy one. It's going to be big. It'll be based on the head count. I think it'll be the most they've had ever. So that's kind of cool. But yeah, we've got work to do. Anyways, we have work to do for this show too.
Oh yeah, people didn't show up to listen to us talk, did they?
I mean, if they did, who are they going to listen to then? Ruckus the dog doesn't talk. I mean, he's cute. He looks, hanging out, playing DJ over there, but he's not talking. So
I got a dog right here.
Again, it's off camera for what we're seeing. The audience can't see it. The people in audio can't see anything, which is probably good for them. But
all right. So if you were to see my camera just over this way,
yeah, that we can see. Now, is that a stuffed dog or is that your live one?
Oh, it's a stuffed dog.
Oh, okay. Because I know you have the live one too, and we're not going to make them famous. But anyways, people didn't want to tune in to hear about us talk dogs. I'm sure that's not what we convened for. So what do we have today, Mr. Palmer?
Today is part 2 of our 10 things we want you to know about Wi-Fi, or 10 things you need to know about Wi-Fi, or 10 things we wish you knew more about or understood with Wi-Fi. So
it's a really long title.
Hopefully we don't use that in the caption, because even at 256 characters, we might run out.
I feel like it's going to be like, it's one of those like, WWJD kind of things where we're going to have to just take the first letter forever. And it's going to be this really, really long, disgusting thing. And we're just going to have fun with it. That could be a sticker. Maybe. There's time. Anyways. So we started.
I have a sticker like that, and it's interesting. But anyway.
Yeah, I'm not going to get into that. I think I actually found mine too. So we started the series a couple weeks ago. The 10 things that people we want people to know or should know or would be good to know, and it's good to remind people. The first one seemed to be well received. So we've got obviously 9 more of these to go. So what's today's item?
All right. So we're going to go back to the slide deck here, and we're going to talk. So just like any good presentation, we're going to introduce it. The 10 things you need to know about Wi-Fi. And if I can get my clicker working.
Oh man, he's going fancy.
Well, if you've ever done a presentation, there's a problem with the clicker every time. So yeah, last episode was the client is always in charge. So if you haven't seen that one, you can go back in the series and you can watch that one. And then the teaser for this episode was more. But more is not always better. And so that is the teaser from the the first episode on this was more. And so what the one thing that we always talk about is, more is not always better. And I kind of put it up there with the it depends thing, where it's that thing that we throw out there all the time. More is not always better. But we also don't actually, I think sometimes we're guilty of not putting enough context behind what is it that we mean when we say more is not always better. And I like to tell a story as we get into this about why more is not always better. And it came from somebody that at the time I thought, they should really know better than this concept that more is not always better, because I was out on vacation and they needed Wi-Fi in a room that was being remodeled. And they were like, oh, we forgot to ask you. So they went to this guy and they said, hey, Jim's on vacation. We need you to design, what do we do for Wi-Fi in this room that we're remodeling and rebuilding? And so I come back to work and they're like, oh yeah, we submitted this design. And it was this room that was probably 20 feet by 40 feet. So, meters is, we're talking about 7 meters by,
I don't know,
12 meters or something. I mean, it was a small room with a fixed number of users that were ever going to be in this room. Now the devices might change a little bit, but all of their stuff was all hardwired in. So everything that was going to be Wi-Fi related in this room was all going to be very incidental, phones and tablets and the occasional laptop type of thing, and nothing was going to be dependent on the Wi-Fi. They just wanted to have it, to have it. And he put in 2 APs in this room. And I was like, and they showed me the design. And I was like, who did this? I was like, there's no way that this room it was completely surrounded by concrete, right? It was down deep in the bowels. It was everything was reinforced concrete, and they had put 2 APs in this room. And I was like, why? And he's like, well, I figured if one was good, 2 was better. And John, you're laughing because more is not always better.
It's true.
So,
oh, that's so true.
And so let's go into this. Let's pick up this discussion from why, I knew that 2 APs in this room that was 7 meters by 12 meters, 20 feet by 40 feet, whatever, with 10 people in it, I'm like, why is more not always better? And the first one that I came up with was because RF airtime is really our limiting factor. That is the one thing, the RF and the time we have within the RF is that limiting factor. And so even though we feel like sometimes it's fine, that the RF airtime, that the RF, that spectrum is always going to be that limiting factor in whatever we do.
I mean, this makes me think of an example, and I think this might be a good segue for you. Maybe it's a little bit premature, but so I, in a past life, had a customer in New York City, and they had a problem. Now, granted, it was a 2.4 gigahertz device, but they were like, this should work. The TV's right here. It was a streaming device. It should work. And we pulled out a Fluke tablet, I think at the time is what we were using. Like, it's going, it's what we had, and they really wanted it for the cable tester, but it was what we had. So whatever. But you just showed the spectrum, and you see it's just a mess. It's an utter mess. And it's just so busy, you can't make it work. And we literally told them the only way you're going to get this to work in here is if you go buy the 5 gigahertz model, because the comment's always the same. Oh, it works fine at home. Well, you don't have like this many neighbors at home. So, RF airtime is finite. It's shared. There's nothing you can do about that. Like, at the end of the day, it's not licensed spectrum. You don't have ownership of it. Even if you have your own building, you can go around and tell people, turn off that device, please. But if they really wanted to fight you and risk their job, they could be really, really pedantic and say, you don't have any control over the spectrum, because it's literally the truth. Now, HR policies and all that and whatnot sure come into play, but it's open spectrum. So there's nothing we can do about it. So there's only a finite amount. It's not like it's not endless. So in that whole more is not always better, it's not endless. We have to conserve it. We have to use it wisely. And I know you have an example for us at some point, maybe down the road. I don't know if you're ready to show that. But that's always been my favorite example, because once you show that, once you see visualization of how crowded the spectrum can get, I think it opens some eyes.
Yeah. And, you brought up a good point about, the residential versus, commercial and stuff like that. If you have your own building and you manage and control the entire building, then you still have the same problems, but instead of being all of the neighbors around you, from all the way that circle you, because it's all you, but you also have a higher demand and you have a higher expectations of what your network can do. We talk about home networks all the time and going, hey, there's no customer more demanding than the family. But, and we kind of joke about that, at least, especially from a priority standpoint. But when you think about what Wi-Fi networks are becoming today, if you have your own building, if you control your own thing, people count on these networks anymore. And so it's even more of a bigger concern, because it's not just, hey, is my son angry at me because, it's going to take an hour and a half, or I don't know how many hours your son was saying it was going to take that game to download.
It was like 11 hours.
Well, it's an inconvenience for your son, but in a commercial setting, that costs money. Time is money.
Yeah.
And so that kind of leads us to the next thing, which is time is our constant. Time never changes. And so when we start talking about the fact that we have limited RF and limited RF our airtime, because that time is the constant and the RF has a limit, it starts to build into this thing where you start to understand and you start to realize that Wi-Fi is really all about the balancing act. It's all about, hey, do I have, how do I make this work to where I can satisfy all of the customers, I can meet the business needs, I can do all these other things, because we have this constant of time, and that's the one thing no one's been able to figure out, is how do you manipulate time. We can manipulate, beam forming, beam flex. We can manipulate all these different little band steerings, all these other things we can manipulate, but we cannot manipulate the time, and RF has that limit. So that's when we end up in these balancing acts that I think a lot of people, don't think about, especially at home, because they're just like, oh, it's all, it's all that. And I'll get to your example here in a little bit, that what I'm going to show off. But the first thing I want to kind of dig into, and I think this is where we're going to spend the meat of our time, John, is all about this balancing. And so let's spend a little bit of time going each one of these little bullet points here about AP count versus co-channel interference. So what do I mean by that? I mean, John, you're an SE from a high level. I mean, this is every time you do a design, this is one of the things that you should be paying attention to.
Yeah. And this is a challenging one. And some of this goes into, and we'll talk about it more on a future one of these episodes, because, well, there's more, but it all ties together. So I used to design in a way because of my, I'm going to have to say it, requirements, or my goal. Actually, it wasn't even a requirement. It was my goal because I was the customer. I used to design for primary, secondary, and tertiary coverage. And I also designed in such a way that each AP, every AP didn't have its own switch, but like my even numbered APs were on one switch, my odds were on another. So if any switch took a dive, I had coverage. And we actually had that happen at least once or twice, where a switch had been down for like a week and nobody noticed it because the coverage was still good. And so good enough that like it didn't really take a dive. Like nobody noticed, and we were a wireless only office at that point, which is great. But you're designing to that and you're building to that and you're lowering your power enough so that everything's not stepping on everything. But if you just throw up 50 APs in that like 2x4 room you're talking about, first of all, you don't have enough space for it. Second of all, it's going to get really hot and it's just not enough channels. I mean, there's so many problems that come up with that. That was a really bad example, but you're not going to put one AP in a warehouse, but you're also not going to put 40 unless you've got the means with which to make sure that they don't all hear each other, thus causing your co-channel interference. The spectrum's finite, right? I mean, if anybody's actually still using 2.4, there's only 3 channels, depending on what bandwidth you're using, what channel width rather you're using, and depending on if you're avoiding things like DFS channels and whatnot. There's more channels than 5 gigahertz, but it's nice to have that space, but it's still finite, and we've chewed through that. That's why we've got 6 gigahertz staring us in the face. So you have to be careful. You can't just throw up APs for the sake of throwing up APs. If you're going to add more, to your point, it's a balancing act, right? I can have 20 APs in a warehouse, but I best know what my power settings need to be, and I best have a really good channel plan and manage it to make sure that, there's, and are there shelves in between AP1 and AP2 so that they can't really hear each other? There's a lot to go into it, and you really need to know what you're doing. And that's why I laughed when you mentioned that somebody designed that while you were on vacation. I had a warehouse design that I did that was like fully funded and taken care of. And somebody who had no clue what they were doing was like, I don't like it. We don't need that many APs. Found like some entry-level network engineer and said, please just take half of them off because he refuses to.
So you hit on something, and we'll go back to the 2.4 gigahertz having 3 channels. It technically has.
All right. It has 11, but depending on where you are.
Depending where you are. So but you only have 3 that's non-overlapping.
Thank you.
And so if you have some overlapping channels in 2.4, and we can actually see that when I show that here in a second, then you have, but because the actual channel, you have what's known as adjacent channel interference. What we're talking about here with co-channel interference is really kind of focused at 5 gigahertz, and your warehouse example is really well, because for the most part, you're going to need more than, say, 25 APs in any decent sized warehouse. I mean, maybe a little tiny one out, it's not really doing a whole lot. You can get away with it. But in bigger warehouses, you need more than 25 APs, and there's only 25 APs or 25 channels at 20 megahertz wide in 5 gigahertz. And that's assuming that all of your scanners that are going to be used in your warehouse support all of the 5 gigahertz channels.
Or support 5 gigahertz at all.
If at all. And so what you end up with is now it's like, hey, I can put in a bunch of APs, but if they start duplicating the channels that they're running on, I now have co-channel interference, which means that even though I have lots of APs and my theoretical speed should be okay, because it's co-channel interference, they're now sharing that RF. They're sharing the RF airtime. And so if we share that airtime between 2, you can automatically assume that you're only going to get about half of that airtime because one AP gets half, the other AP gets half. If you end up with 3, now we're down to 33% of the airtime because of co-channel interference. If you have 3 APs that can all hear each other, you're going to spend a lot more of your time listening and not moving data. So that's where that count versus co-channel interference comes from, which then leads us into the next point, or actually it'd be the couple points down here that'll kind of tie together, but is transmit power versus AP count. So there are ways to deal with it, to deal with the co-channel interference and that balancing act, which is you can reduce the transmit power on your APs that you put in, which then means you get to put in more APs, but then there's other problems that go along with more APs. And so it's like, where do you get that balance of, do I reduce the transmit power on my APs so far down that I don't have co-channel interference so I can get more APs, but then installing that and managing that and licensing that now becomes a problem. That's now become, and all of a sudden you're making problems for yourself that probably doesn't exist by simply just saying, hey, I'm going to add a whole bunch of APs, because then you end up on the back end after it's already installed and all done. And I lost count of how many people were like, oh, I've gone into networks, and the first thing I did to fix it, because they put in a brand new network and it never worked, and it worked terribly bad and it was horrible. And so I fixed that by turning off half the APs.
Yeah. I mean, it's been said a few times. And the one thing I'll say about this is it all depends on what you're trying to do. either what your goal is or what your customer's objectives are. I'm not going to say it because I'm saving that for later. But I had, again, going back to a prior example, I put more APs up. The same example where I had primary, secondary, and tertiary coverage. You lower the power as low as you can comfortably go, depending on the AP of choice. Maybe you're using directional antennas so you can have smaller cells. If you're doing a wireless only office, as that was, your goal is to have a specific number of clients on a particular AP because of voice concerns and things like that. So it depends on what you're trying to do. But you have to know what you're doing, because it is possible. And I think this is another point we'll make on another one of these down the road. It's possible to do this wrong. And like you said, like, people put this out, they think they've got a great thing and it's really not. And then somebody comes in and cuts the AP count in half, and all of a sudden everything performs better. Because I think a lot of people that don't know what they're doing about it, like you said, with CCI, if you have 3 APs that can hear each other, that's a third of the time that they can actually broadcast, transmit, do their thing. Mm-hmm. What is also forgotten, and I know this is, I'm not trying to steal your thunder, but everything that you put in the air has to take up airtime, to which goes back to your first point. Airtime is a limiting factor. So that's not to say one AP is the best model because you've only got one AP and there's only one set of beacons going on. That's not the case at all. But it's almost like a slide rule. I feel like somebody had one at some point. Actually, there probably was at some point that, you can put this many APs in an environment, but your airtime utilization is going to go up by X based on your AP count, your SSIDs, and things like that. So it's always a balancing act. And it's something that as a Wi-Fi professional, you have to keep it in mind, because I'll give an example. I always like to use it when I'm talking to customers now. And even when I was talking to customers at my last job, and I think you might have more on power in a little bit, but you've got transmit power. If you look at a prosumer device, think about I'm not going to name names because I'm not going to bash anybody, but literally I can remember the last one I used before I started going like enterprise gear in my house. You have like settings that was always like good, better, best. And it doesn't explain why, it doesn't explain how, but the reality is best would always be like, let's do 5 gigahertz, right? So it would always be 80 megahertz wide would be your best setting, and it would be cranked at max power. But the reality is, again, to your point, 80 megahertz wide might not be the best for your neighborhood. It might be 40, it might be 20, and max power is not great when it comes to Wi-Fi. So think about it like you're going to a concert or you're just playing your car radio and you crank it up to 11, you're blowing out your speakers. That sounds horrible. It's the same thing when you blast a Wi-Fi AP at full power in most cases. Not all the cases. There are some exceptions for different use cases, but for the most part, you want to use the widest channel bandwidth that you can get away with and the lowest power that you can survive on. Not max of anything. It's just, but again, it's the balancing act.
So we don't have the time to go into the religious discussion that you just brought up, which is the transmit power. Because while I will agree with you on setting your transmit power on your APs to be the maximum is not always for the most part, not a good idea. I'm not going to use absolutes, but I will say from my religious standpoint, from my side of the religion, that is the AP transmit power, I am a fan of operating at not the maximum power, but a little bit below. I want to be 3 dB down from the maximum power that my AP can do. Other people will tell you need to be even further down because we want to match the transmit power of the client. That's the two sides of this religious discussion. And just like anything that's religious, it can get pretty
intense
and heated, and people are very defensive of their religion.
I wouldn't even call it. I mean, we can say it's religious. We can say it's political. I'll say this about that. Like, I don't have any. I just want it to work. That's at the end of the day, I think we both do. I don't have any skin in that particular battle, but I will say this about that, and it does depend. And that's not being pedantic. It does depend on the devices you're using. We both know who we work for. Obviously, this is the Ruckus Corporate Podcast, but how one vendor does power will differ from other vendors potentially. there's different approaches, there's different methodologies. So you need to know the tools you're using. For us, the rules are a little bit different. I'm not saying physics don't apply to Ruckus gear at all. That's not the case. And we're certainly never going to talk physics here if I can help it, because I hated high school physics. But anyways, I did better in college. Go figure. But it can be a very, look, if you're around Wi-Fi long enough, there's plenty of those quote unquote religious hot button topics, static versus, RRM. That's another battle. If you want to really start a war, walk into WLPC in a month and just scream out the 2.4 is dead. I mean, that used to do it. Maybe it still does. I don't know. Ghost frames, I think, was one.
Oh,
but we're not here to start fights. We're not here to encourage this sort of behavior at all. But I underscore it with, it is that balancing act. But you have to have a heavy appreciation and understanding for what you're trying to do and what you're tuning and tweaking, because there's always those unintended consequences, and ultimately you've got to pay attention to it, because
we could do a 30-minute episode just on transmit power. So,
oh, absolutely. And that's the challenge, right? We try to keep these nice and short and sweet and digestible, but the reality is so many of these topics could be their own tangent of a 30-minute episode at least, and probably a lot longer than that. I mean, and again, anybody listening, you'll see it in Phoenix in a month. You'll go to Prague in October. You'll see it there. Anytime you get a gathering of enough Wi-Fi professionals, and Jim, you've said it, I know you said it on an episode last year, you put enough of us in a room, let's say 10 for arbitrary purpose. You put 10 Wi-Fi engineers in a room, you're probably going to get at least 6 or 7 different ways to do it, if not 10. And you might even get more than 10. So
speaking of transmit power, there's a thing called DB math, and most of the early Wi-Fi, when you're first learning Wi-Fi, people will talk about DB math, and there's the rules of 3s and 10s. And so you can go look it up. I'm not going to spend the time here, but there's a lady who had what she called Mohs corollary to the rules of 3s and 10s, or the law of 3 and 10s. And Mohs corollary states that if you put 3 Wi-Fi engineers in a room and give them a problem, give them a design requirement, say to build this design, they're going to come up with 10 different solutions, and all of them are going to be right. So that's Mohs corollary. Hi, Mo.
But I mean, and this is one of those reasons why at the end of the day, people, and we've talked about this at length, it depends is really not the jerky response that it sounds. It does. It really does. You need to understand what you're doing and why. And even then, you could be the smartest person in the room. You fully understand what you're doing and why, and there's still more than one right answer. But that's the beauty part. That is the beauty of Wi-Fi. If you know what you're doing and you know the tools that you have to do it with, there's usually more than one right way to do it. And I know you've said it. I've heard it from other people as well. Wi-Fi works in spite of us, not because of us.
Yeah.
Like, honest to God, and literally it's designed like, you'll hear people complain, oh, it's working at like, I'm doing like 2 meg a second. It's working. It's literally what it was designed to do. It was never designed to be like high speed, high throughput. Like, this is all great that it's doing it, but it was initially designed to be like a resilient battlefield communication mechanism, right? Like, it wasn't, but anyways, that's a whole different horse for a different day, but
now that we went off on that tangent, I did not expect that one little bullet point to do that. But
yeah, you've got that kind of power.
Moving on.
Yep.
So we touched on this a little bit, the channel bandwidth versus CCI, and this is part of all of that balancing act. And you said it, and there's a person who I know has told both of us the same thing at different times, because Keith Parsons, he says this all the time. His mantra is design for as wide of a channel as you can until you can't. And that concept is the fact that, it goes back to the RF part of it. And I think I'll pop that up here in a second. We have so much RF, and until we got 6 gigahertz, we used to say we're not getting any more. But at the same time, we also didn't pay for what we have. So it's like, why not use it? And so when people say, do I use 20 megahertz, 40 megahertz, 80 megahertz? And now that we're at 6 gigahertz, the question is, well, do I use 160 megahertz? I think we have to now start including that as a normal question, a normal conversation. 320 megahertz, I'm still probably going to say no on that one. But for 160 megahertz and 6 gigahertz, we can have that discussion, but it's always it's that balancing act, right? You want to go as wide of the channel as you can so that you can move the most data as you can when you have the time on the channel to transmit and receive data. And it goes back to that time factor. When you have that time, you want to utilize that as much of the resource as efficiently and as best you can during your transmit opportunity, your TX-op, whether it's the AP sending data to the client or my client sending data to the AP. And so if I just arbitrarily say I'm going to use 20 megahertz wide channels and I only have, 4 APs, I'm literally, I'm sort of hamstringing myself. It will work, but you can make it work so much better. And so it's that balancing act of saying, but at the same time, if you just say, I'm going to run 80 megahertz wide everywhere and you have 50 APs,
good luck.
That's the problem. So now
you use everything you can until you can't. And that's with channel width. That's with all the channels. I have folks that I work with that have reasons behind not using certain channels in the 5 gigahertz spectrum. And we've had conversations about this. And if they're listening, they know about it. But, the idea and the commentary is use everything you have in front of you until you know you can't. So thinking about DFS channels, same thing. If you've got a DFS hit and you know that you're constantly going to be hitting that one channel because of radar, because you're like right next door to an airport, then take that out of your channel plan. If you know that you're in the middle of a prairie and there's nobody around and it's just you, chances are you can get away with 40 megahertz wide. You might even be able to get away with 80. And I'd be remiss if I didn't do a shameless plug that says, it used to be you can do 20, 40, or 80. But what if I told you there was a technology that allowed you to do 20, 40, and 80? You want to talk more about that? We've had the episode last year. We'll have them on again this year, I'm sure, as improvements continue to come. But ARRM through RUCKUS AI allows you to do that. And it's definitely got a lot of promise when you're talking about what's coming down with 6 gigahertz managing channel plans. But sort of a different tangent and something I'd be also remiss if I didn't plug it, because thinking about more is not always better, and dividing up the airtime and everything. There was this guy I knew, used to work at an airport. He wrote a blog. I can't remember his name. It's on the tip of my tongue, but it's not quite this conversation, but it's related to it, because there was always that theory that you want to segment a guest. You want to carve out a piece of the network for the guest. And if I give this guest a 10 megahertz or 10 megabits per second, and everybody's got a 10 meg cap, that everybody's sharing the pie and it's great. And he did the study that if you take the cap off, everything improves. Maybe we should link to that. I got to remember who he was.
Well, his point was that it's still a time, right? It's still time is the constant. And the point of it was, when you have that transmit opportunity, when you have your time when you're that one client device that gets the transmit or receive, to get data, to move data on the channel at that time, then you need to make the most, the best utilization of that. And rate limiting down to something ridiculous, and the thing I always heard was, well, I don't want the Netflix people streaming, the guests who are streaming Netflix on my hospital network to prevent all the heart monitors from transmitting to the nurse's station. It's like, I can't have that. And it's like, well, then don't let the guests on your Wi-Fi network.
There's better designs to do that. You want to get them on, get them off.
To do it. Because the problem is when you rate limit me, I'm going to spend every possible time I have where it's my time on the channel. Yep. I'm going to utilize that. Whereas if you remove the rate limit, I'm not changing my channel bandwidth. I'm just saying, hey, when I have access to the channel, if I'm running 20 megahertz wide channels, I have 2 spatial streams, at 11 AC, I can get 144 megabits per second. Right. But if I can get 144 megabits per second in that 1 second I have the channel, then all of a sudden I don't need to come back 18 different time slots into the future to try to get my 10 or 14 at that point. It's going to take me 14 times the amount of time to get my 144 megabits, as opposed to just saying, you know what, it's your time on the channel. You get that one time. So get it and then get off. Go Go sit in the corner, be quiet, and watch your video.
Yep.
You know,
Yeah,
and so
no, and this is one of those things where, again, if you don't know what you're doing, you don't know that you don't realize that has those kind of impact. And I thought about the time thing and it made me think of it. I wish we could have him on. He'd be a good guest.
Possibly. But let's move on. Let's move on to a special topic that we've touched on once or twice, is about SSIDs versus VLANs.
How many people listening have heard, like, I want my own SSID?
Oh my God. Oh,
we've all dealt with it. I mean, I think it's like a rite of passage, right? You inherit a company, you inherit a network, and there's like 18 SSIDs.
And a lot of times people they don't understand. And they also say, and way back in the day, it used to be, if to get one SSID or to get on your own VLAN, you needed to have your own SSID. It used to be explained that an SSID was basically an extension of the VLAN on the network switch. And so it would be like, so if you want to extend that VLAN 10, then you need to have an SSID named VLAN 10. And then you connect to that VLAN 10 SSID, and it would be just like you were on VLAN 10 on your corporate network. And so there was this whole idea that, hey, in order to get your own Wi-Fi, your own SSID, your own VLAN, you all had to have. So then you end up with a lot of SSIDs because there's lots of VLANs. There's 4,000 VLANs, 4096. And so no way you can get 4096 SSIDs on the air. That's besides the point. But this is where I kind of want to go back to the idea of okay, so now that we're balancing, right? AP counts, co-channel interference, transmit power versus AP count, channel bandwidth versus CCI. The next thing we're going to talk about is SSIDs. And this is something that I was actually talking to somebody this morning about, and that is my home. So I showed this off. I did this on the live stream, and people were like, it's just really kind of interesting to show this stuff. And we can take a look at 2.4 and we can see the disaster that is 2.4 around my house. And we can see this guy right here. I have a little toggle for that guy. And this is, and quite honestly, I'm kind of surprised because normally I see a lot. Oh, there he is. There we go. So these are all the things that you should never do at 2.4 because this CME, the one that just dropped off. Yeah, that was on one of there's 3 non-overlapping channels. And, it was on one that sat in between. So it was actually overlapping on 1 and 6. Then we have some of these that are running 40 megahertz wides because, we need more channel bandwidth, except they're now overlapping with everybody on 1 and 6, plus the guy who was running on 9, who was then overlapping on the guy running on 40. So if you had a 40 megahertz wide channel running at 2.4 gigahertz, in this particular case, you could, in essence, jam the entire 83 megahertz worth of spectrum by using 2 40 megahertz wide channels, which is kind of ridiculous. So, but now let's switch over and let's take a look at this. This is my neighborhood. Actually, this is me. This is my neighborhood. And one of the things I wanted to focus on, and this is what I was talking about to somebody this morning, was all of these hidden networks that exist in residential neighborhoods. Now, we all know why they're there, but the thing to keep in mind, especially in 5 gigahertz, 6 gigahertz has a solution for this. So, if you needed a reason to shift over from 5 to 6, this is one of them. Is all of these additional SSIDs, each one of these takes a beacon on the channel, so you can have one device, one customer residential device you get from your ISP, and it's so we'll call that one AP. But it has 3 different SSIDs being broadcasted on that channel. But only one of those SSIDs is for the actual person using it. The other 2 are for all these other things. And even if nobody's using it, it's still beacon airtime. So when we take a look at the beacons, thanks to Wi-Fi Explorer Pro, I can easily show this off to people and we can say, oh, look at this. We have 45 networks living on channel 44, with 6 overlapping networks, and the beacon overhead is 20% of my time. So if you have this idea, if you have one AP that has 16 VLANs extended onto the into SSIDs, and you have 60 because you can put 16 on it. So why not? What's the harm? Well, all of a sudden it's like, oh, we now have beacon overhead at 27%. This is back in channel 2.4,
and it's worth saying something with it for anybody who's kind of learning and watching along with us. And my condolences, but they're going to sit there and say, well, you got 100%, right? 20% is not that bad, but it's actually worse than it sounds, because at least how I've always been told and how I've always approached the spectrum, once you get to about 50% utilization, that's not good to be sitting at 50%. And that's 20% is just beacons. That's not traffic. That's not, you and me and everybody else streaming their Netflix movies or whatever. That's just constant traffic. That's always going to be there. So you've only got about 30% or so before you start seeing things get kind of squirrely.
So in newer protocol, in newer generations of Wi-Fi, that number's increased. 50% is still, but you look at this one, this top one right here, 68% channel utilization. So, and it probably still works because let's take a look. Let's scroll over. It's got a DTIM of 3. But this is Wi-Fi 6. So 802.11ax. So 65% is still usable. But when you get to about 75 to 80% now today, it just stops working. Everything just completely stops. So it's not, when John talks about 25% beacon overhead, it's not 25%, it's 25% of 100, because that's a percentage, but it's really not of 100. You're carving out 20%. And so what you're left with is not 80, you're actually left with 60. And so when you start seeing some of these numbers get super high up in here, and this is actually we're middle of the day, here in snowed this morning. So snowy Colorado, this is, but it didn't snow a whole lot. So people didn't shut everything down, but this is the problem that we have, is when because then you come in and you take a look at it for, just the networks I'm running, and I can run 80 megahertz wide channels all day long because, if we look, nobody else is using that spectrum. So I might as well run 80s, but in other environments, when you're using all of this spectrum in the middle, you can't do that. So that's that balancing act, right? But I also have to balance, because I will tell you that late last night, I had to get out of bed, come down to my office and turn off some APs that I forgot I'd plugged in, because now I had too many APs, and the Wi-Fi, my office is on the ground floor, my Wi-Fi up on the second floor was unstable. And so I had to come down here, unplug all my APs that I'd plugged in doing work yesterday, so that I could reduce my AP counts, because they were jamming all these center channels and it was making my Wi-Fi unusable. And I fixed my Wi-Fi by turning off APs. I'm the story, and I'm the story less than 24 hours ago. So that's why it's that balancing act. I tell people all the time, I could fix, residential Wi-Fi if you let me trim all these 80 megahertz wide channels that are all here. If you let me trim them to 40, and then we distribute them across all of the 5 gigahertz channels.
Yeah, and in fairness, we're picking on the residential because it's easy. And
I'm here.
Well, but at the end of the day, we're working from home. That's what we do when we're not at customer sites or at events or things like that. But the reality is, it goes back to the prosumer example that, if you have a choice, it's good, better, best. If you're getting something from your service provider, you go in an ISP, you're getting the router, the internet package, the home cable, everything bundled. They're plugging it in, and the defaults are 80. The defaults are, full power. And I'm not saying people don't know what they're doing, but a lot of people at home don't. And that's not a knock. It's just reality. They're not Wi-Fi engineers. They don't care. They want it to work. The technician plugs it in. Hey, look, there's your SSID. Look, you can log in. Okay, fine. See you later. And they don't know that they should turn it down. They don't know that they can change the channel. And, we're coming from an enterprise world. And the other thing, of course, is if you contact some of them for tech support, especially, I mean, the humorous ones we've seen before, like, oh, try a different channel. And I loved it when it was one of those, and it was probably on Twitter. They were like, oh, change it from 1 to 2. No, that's not acceptable. Like, it's not a non-overlapping channel. So take it with a grain of salt. But this is one of the things where, like, and I've told neighbors all the time, like, if you really want to be able to do what you can do at home better, pay the, whatever. And I think Adrian's got a free or a light version of this. It's not as, even Explorer Pro is not a huge investment when you think about it for us, but
yeah,
you get something like this, you can see what your neighbors are doing, and then what you can get away with. And that's how we know we can run 80 wide at our houses, because we know where the sweet spots are.
So you mentioned something and I want to focus on.
Oh boy.
Why does residential go with 80 megahertz wide? We just said we spent 35 minutes talking about this whole balancing act.
It's marketing.
It's this number right here that we're looking at in this column called the max rate. And when we take a look at it, the maximum rate at 80 megahertz wide with Wi-Fi 6, here we are, 802.11 ANACAX, right, is 2.4 gigabits per second. This is a number that a lot of devices nowadays will show you. Hey, you're connected at this rate right here. So the problem is if you're trying to get customers to pay for the highest speed, and yet you go to a 40 megahertz wide channel, or let's take a look at my test one right here, right? Now, this is a Wi-Fi 5 ANAC, running 20 megahertz wide channels connected to, this is my RUCKUS One AP. I'm only getting 260 megabits per second. So that does not sell very well, especially when I'm sitting here going, well, what about this one that does 573? Or, again, then you scroll down this list and you go, well, what about this one that does 1.7? Or what about this one down here that does 2.4 gigabits per second? So it's 80 megahertz wide, and it's only in Uni 1 and Uni 3 because
more power.
Well, and it's also more client device support, because one of the things you talked about was DFS channels.
That's true.
At 120, 124, 128, there's also another channel in here we sometimes forget about, which is 144, which is not always supported. So if you put your stuff on 144, you have client devices that won't be able to see it because they don't work on channel 144. And so it's all about this balancing act, and which is where everything comes from. But yeah, that from a marketing perspective, marketing never wants to say what's going to be the most effective. They want to say what's the fastest. No. What is, and the best we can get is 2.4. And if we were to switch over to 6 gigahertz, which I can do, but I don't have any 6 gigahertz online because that's one of the APs that I unplugged last night so that my Wi-Fi would work for my wife. You would see something even wider, and we would see even higher max data rates. So that's where that comes from. That's where, this balancing act come from. This is where we're going to wrap this up and say, hey, that's more is not always better. If you know what you're doing, if you know the rules, if you know how this stuff works, then you said it. You figure out what everybody else is doing, and then you know how you can do it to where it's the best that you can make it. Because in reality, that's what we all want. We all want the best networks. And, and so that's where this balancing act comes from, is you take all of this more stuff and all of these different bullet points that we have listed down here, and you balance it, and you find that sweet spot between all of those where, my phone, or in this case, John's phone. Don't ask me why I'm holding up John's phone, but this is John's phone. John's phone, while it might be able to connect to 2.4 gigabits.
John has 2 phones.
One of John's phones, while it can connect at 2.4 gigabits per second, is it going to use it? And so that's finding that sweet spot. That's what we want you to understand is it's when you want to make a stable, productive network that people can count on, that is you're not having to babysit every single day, that you're not having to do all this stuff. It's all about finding that balance between, where does all these things balance out between what is this maximum fire rate number that's in all the marketing versus what is actually needed to make our networks work, for the purpose that we're building them and installing them.
And that's a really good segue into what comes after number 2. It's the what. And it's not just what goes into it from our end as engineers. What are we deploying? But it's a matter of sitting down with your customer, or if you are the customer, sitting down with your bosses who approve purchasing and things like that. What are you trying to do? What are you trying to achieve? At the end of the day, to hit on the marketing, because I like beating up on this one, everybody always tells you it works better at home. It works better with 80 wide. I want the numbers that are on the box. I bought this thing for my kids. It says it can do like 16 gigawatts, and I want that. And the reality is, I said, read the very fine print. Take out the magnifying glass. Look at the very, very fine small print. That was achieved in a lab with a device that was within like a centimeter of the antenna. And oh, by the way, nobody else can buy that device because it doesn't exist. It has to be hooked up to a gas generator. It requires too much power. And if you put it on your laptop, you're going to burn yourself. Like, those are the realities we're dealing with. It's a reference device. It's a reference lab. It's a very specific set of test circumstances to achieve that max fire rate from a wireless device. The reality is no cell phone is going to do that because you don't have enough antennas. You don't have enough space. The battery would be depleted in, just way too fast a time. So what are you realistically trying to achieve? And one of the things, and I'll kind of close my thing with this, setting the table for episode 3 in this series. I learned this a long time ago from Chris Avance in a class. You don't have to go for the drag race speeds. You need like a solid 20 to 30 meg per user, solid, reliable, consistent. Maybe it's a little bit more now. That was, the conversation admittedly was 5 or 6 years back, but consistent and reliable user experience. Because if at that rate, you're getting good voice calls, you can download your movies, you can surf the internet, you can send emails. Nobody's going to notice a blip because it's steady and reliable, and they're not going to complain. They don't care about the drag race. The people that come to you at the help desk and say, I ran a speed test and I'm not getting the speeds I should. Speed test is not a reliable tool for troubleshooting, and we can talk about that on another episode too. We've talked about that as well. It's all about meeting the requirements. So, and that's key.
It's even at a more basic level. But Wi-Fi is always about balancing. And I've said this more times than I can care to admit. We don't get anything for free. So we have to balance. We have to make this balance of, and there's so much that goes into this that, like your son was complaining the other night about it was going to take 11 hours to download his game, and he wanted the Wi-Fi to go faster. And my response to you was, it's probably being rate limited from the server on the other end. So you could have, 10 gigabits per second connection to the internet. But if the server on the other end, and that was that rate limiting conversation as well, and we can post a link to that guy. It's all about because you have to then take that into consideration, which then leads us into what. So now we need to have this whole big conversation about what, but we've more than 100% crushed our time for this episode.
But it was good.
But always. It is. But it always comes. Wi-Fi is about the balance. It's about the balance between speed and reliability and dependability and capacity and coverage and all of these other things. But we cannot get all of that in a medium, in an RF environment that is shared and is built to your earlier point, to work. And even when it's poor, when it's bad, it still works, because 2 megabits per second sounds like a joke now. But I can tell you, when I upgraded my modem from 14.4 to like 28.8, I was like, this is the best thing ever. And then I heard this thing, I read it in a newspaper where it was like, hey, 56K. And I was like, ooh, 56K. I want in on 56K. So, there we go.
All right. I think we've definitely beat this one up, and we went a little long, but that's okay. I have nothing else. Any closing thoughts?
No, it's just, again, these are, And the reason why John and I can go on for so long about this stuff is because these are things that are such universal truths and such things that even when you argue about transmit power, the argument is never about, is transmit power important? Or is this stuff important? The argument is, how do we implement that stuff? But that's why John and I are so passionate about some of these topics, is because these are things that we are constantly talking about, because it's a constantly moving target. So when we talk to customers, when we talk to people and we say, hey, we want to be able to have these same conversations so that we can get to design these networks for you, for the end user, for the customer, that's going to work as well. And as long as you guys can understand, as long as these people understand some of these things that we know as universal truths, then it allows us to have conversations that are more beneficial and are, don't take an hour per topic to have this conversation to get to a network that's going to work as best as it can for your network and your use case and your situation. And so that's where the what comes from, is now that we sort of went with the, more, now we're going to go with the what in a couple of weeks. So hopefully you join us again, and we'll go on another wild tangent ride of,
this one had more tangents than usual, but they were good tangents.
But again, it's one of these things that we debate, and we've debated for so long that we can, if we can get people up to speed to where, we can have the conversations without having to backtrack as much, then we can get to better solutions faster.
Yep. Agreed. All right. I got nothing else.
Nope. I'm good, John.
We'll see everybody on the next episode then.
Thanks for joining us.
If you want to contact the show directly, you can email us using the address ruckcast@comscope.com. To learn more about Ruckus products and services that we may have talked about on this or any other podcast, please check the links in the About section of the show.